Hey there, welcome back to the Intergenerational Trauma Show. We are going to talk about difficult cases and best practices in supporting difficult cases in intergenerational trauma therapy. So, one little note before we start, I am at home and my neighbors are having their roof done. And so we've had a lot of air nailing and scraping going on. So I'm hoping the microphone I use won't capture that. But if it does, no problem, and we'll just kind of get past that. So today, what we're going to talk about are the complexities in families who are impacted by intergenerational trauma that create significant impacts on the therapy process. So the word I don't like is resistance, but we have to look at that word because it will come up a lot in sometimes in people's conceptualization of cases and things like that. So I'm going to reframe that and teach you how I look at what people call resistance in therapy. We're also going to look at strategies to engage clients and families, including direct and indirect interventions, including client interests and culture, and celebrating small achievements. The other important part of this is maintaining therapist presence and perseverance and self-care during dealing with difficult cases. So there's some unique challenges with intergenerational trauma therapy because it's a very unique and specialized practice area. It's very complex due to the significance of impacts that can happen and the generational nature of the trauma. So we're not just dealing with individual trauma, we're dealing with the entire family system, the impacts on the current family system we're working with, plus previous generations. So with the greater impacts of intergenerational trauma, you'll see greater complexity in the therapy setting and you'll have more difficult cases. So if you're working in an area that has clients who have had significant intergenerational trauma over many generations due to like historical or cultural trauma, you're going to see more complexity, but you'll be able to handle it. So let's start about understanding resistance in therapy. So resistance, I don't like that word because it increases like a negative perception of clients. It also pits us against the client. It becomes like an oppositional interaction if we're saying that somebody's resistant. It also imposes our views, beliefs, or goals onto that person. And yes, we are experts and we do know what we need to do to help support families, but we also have to do it in a way that's acceptable to them and help support them. So when we use that word, I find that the therapist actually can become defended too. And I look at um, conceptualizing difficult cases as being defended, and I look at it through a polyvagal lens that it's the nervous system, that they're either defended or shut down and they haven't had the right experiences to feel safe and comfortable in the therapy setting or in relationships or kind of even their own individual experience. They may be kind of alienated from that as well. So if we look at it as difficult cases and not resistance and not difficult clients, it kind of reframes it and recognizes the impacts of intergenerational trauma rather than the individual's presentation. And that presentation is there for a reason. It likely served a function in the past and kept them safe in some way. It's just interfering in the present. So I look at resistance as resilience that's no longer useful. So what this means is that they're engaging in behaviors that are kind of trauma interfering in their therapy interfering behaviors. If you're a DBT therapist, you recognize that term. So it can range from anything like avoiding engaging in the therapy process. So you'll have no shows, canceled appointments. They'll be kind of inaccessible if you try to call them or try to reschedule appointments or try to talk about their child's therapy. And they just kind of avoid engagement in the therapy process. So this, at some level in the history of the individual, this behavior probably protected them in some ways. If they put walls up with other people, they may be less likely to be hurt. So that would be a way to protect yourself. It would be an adaptive coping response. So it's resilient, but it's no longer useful. So it starts to get in the way, it starts to cause problems. Another type of therapy interfering behavior that I see, in addition to avoidance, is jealousy related to the therapy relationship with the child. So, as a therapist, like, we are not in the same role as a parent. We're not trying to get them to get up, to go to bed, to brush their teeth, go to school. We're not doing that. So, our relationship with the child is very different from parenting, but it has a lot of parallels and similarities. So the parent may become frustrated if we don't emphasize that we have to fix this child. And that's one of the buzzwords that, if you're hearing that word, you need to look into. Is there any unresolved trauma on the parent's part that is causing the perception that the child is broken and needs to be fixed? So they sometimes try to engage in a way, because they're distressed and they're looking for help and support related to their child's behavior, that they may try to influence us or have us really understand and see the negative parts of the child and their behavior. So if we align with them, we're not going to be as effective with the child. If we don't in some way acknowledge and give space for their experience and their feelings and work through this with them, they could shut down therapy because they just feel like we just blasted in and have this fun, playful relationship with the child, and it's so unfair to the parent. But this relationship is totally different than parenting, and we need to help them understand that. Sometimes it will go so far that the parent will actually sabotage the child or teen's therapy. I've seen examples of, we do a safe place and we've done all this work in a child friendly way of polyvagal theory and safety and preparing to do trauma work, and we create these little baskets of a little character and things that make them safe, and the parent throws it out right in front of the office because they think it's just crafts. So we need to know that stuff, because that is going to be really difficult on that child. And we need to engage the parent in a way where that kind of thing won't happen, and they will understand what the importance of that safe place for that little character was. Another area that may present difficulties is co-regulation with the child, and it will affect the therapist too. So basically, co-regulation, if there's difficulties with co-regulation, it's usually in several relationships, and it will definitely filter into therapy. So you'll find that there will be a range of responses that go from defended to shut down, and it'll be to the point where they may have huge barriers in relationships with other people. They may be very guarded or defended, or they may just not engage and not be open, and it'll be really hard to develop a therapeutic relationship with them. So this negatively, that shutdown or defensiveness negatively affects the parent-child relationship. So it makes it hard for the child to learn self-regulation through the co-regulation with the parent. It also impacts the therapist-client relationship as well, because they may have never had an experience of co-regulation, where they may be very defended or shut down to our attempts of trying to co-regulate with them in order to help them better self-regulate. So this is area that is really important to watch for and to know if these difficulties are there. So the defendedness that we see is likely related to complex trauma symptoms, and the impacts are rooted in the parent's own developmental trauma. So developmental trauma impacts attachment, behavior, sensory, physical development. It impacts so many areas that they can have difficulties with autonomic regulation. So they're either very defended and reactive, or they may be very difficult to engage and shut down. They may have difficulty with emotion regulation. So when they get mad, they're really mad and explosive, or they're mad and they just pull away and they may never contact you again. And sometimes there's difficulties identifying emotions. When there's been developmental trauma for a child, which then becomes complex trauma as an adult, you can have huge difficulties with even recognizing how one feels, how you feel yourself, and how others may feel. So if they can't identify those emotions, we need to be aware of that so we can help support the development and the awareness of those emotional states in themselves and in their children. There's sometimes behavioral or impulse control difficulties. So that's using self-soothing that may be kind of destructive, like substance abuse, drug use, relationships, those things that they kind of regulate, but they're in that faux window and they don't really regulate and they cause more problems later. There also may be cognitive impacts related to responsibility. So when there's developmental trauma, a lot of times it's difficult for children to develop an appropriate sense of responsibility and self-responsibility. So they can become very shaming of themselves and they believe that everything is their fault, or this is an extreme and there is variations. So it's everything is their fault and a lot of shame, or they just can't take responsibility for everything because they feel like the whole world just has a huge impact on them. So that may be in the parent relationship entering therapy. So we need to really watch all of those factors to see how we need to navigate through this to support the parent and the child in the best way possible. The next one is negative mentalization of the child. So mentalization is how we understand somebody else's mind and how we interpret their behavior as a result. So this you'll see things like he's trying to drive me nuts, or she's doing this on purpose, and they're manipulating and all those kinds of things. That's how the parent is understanding the child's behavior and their mind. So when there's negative mentalization, you'll see a lot of emotional reactivity to the child and their behavior. So they'll interpret behavior as willful or purposeful, and they'll believe that the child is manipulating or acts in a manipulative way. So they may also have some defendedness towards their own understanding of the impact of unresolved trauma. If these are generational patterns that have gone through several generations, this is the norm to them. So they're not going to see that this is a pattern of defendedness or shutdown that is impacting the family system. To them, this is just what family is, or this is how life works and how families are, how people handle their emotions. They may also have come from more difficult circumstances. So say the parents' developmental trauma included physical abuse and they endured that, but they have not used physical discipline strategies on their children. Huge progress, that should be commended. However, they will see that is their child doesn't have it as bad as they did if that trauma is unresolved. So you'll hear things like, well, at least I don't hit you, or I'll give you something to cry about. And that's that negative mentalization of the child, that they're just always wanting something or complaining about things and they actually have it much better. They may have it much better, but it still may have some things that are passing along those intergenerational trauma impacts. The other thing that will impact therapy is those rigid parenting strategies. When we feel out of control, we typically tend to try to gain control and mastery over what we feel powerless over. So, this you can see really rigid parenting strategies, and you'll see a huge emphasis on behavioral interventions. So, they will have a lot of maybe some reinforcement, but a lot of punishment and consequences. And sometimes it can go into shaming the child's behavior to try to get it to stop, which doesn't work. Um, but that might be the skills and strategies that they experienced. And because they feel like things are out of control, they may try to use those strategies to get a lot of control of the behavior of the younger people in the family. Another very tricky area that will take you by surprise is when the parents had their therapy for their own trauma, and they've done well, it's resolved, it's integrated, they're functioning well, but it doesn't address the impacts on parenting and the parent-child relationship. It's a whole different level that you can do trauma therapy for complex trauma and address those impacts, but there's still impacts that can be there that are unresolved in the parent-child relationship. And you won't know that until you kind of maybe step on a landmine, because it can really erupt. And it's surprising because the parents usually look like they're doing really well, but they can get triggered very easily by the child's behavior. So we have to have this balance between recognizing and honoring their progress while also supporting the need to shift their parenting strategies. And it's difficult for them because they feel justified because of their previous therapy. They feel a lot of people don't understand that intergenerational trauma impacts the attachment relationship. So there's really more than one thing that we need to address. We need to address more than the individual person's trauma impacts. We need to also address the impact on their parenting and relationships. So they may be unaware of the impacts on their trauma on their parenting. They may not even have a clue that some of these strategies are harsh. They're shaming because they feel like they're not triggered by their trauma anymore, but they are triggered by their kids. And sometimes, like, that's a normal thing in a parent-child relationship, but this is going to have a little more energy to it, and it might become very defensive very quickly. So those are the shockers that'll suddenly erupt in therapy, and you may not be expecting it. So it's really important when you have a parent that has done their own work to start looking at how are they triggered by the child's behavior and the child's trauma. So if you have my 5 domains checklist for therapists on the impacts of intergenerational trauma, you'll recognize those categories that we just went through are on that checklist. So if you don't have that, go to 5domainschecklist.com and you'll be able to download your own copy and a mini training on that, which will be very helpful in identifying all these impacts and the things that make these cases pretty complicated. We're going to move into strategies that are direct and indirect that engage difficult clients and families. So, direct interventions, when I work with intergenerational trauma, the direct interventions is actually the structure of the intergenerational trauma program. So it's a slow, graduated progression into addressing the parent's unresolved trauma. It doesn't start there. It starts with calming the family nervous system before addressing the parent's unresolved trauma, because we want to stabilize and calm the family system as much as we can. It takes a lot of the stress out, it takes a lot of the distractions out, and then we want to support the parent to resolve their own trauma. And then we work on the child's trauma impacts as well. And then we focus on the family relationships and connection. So it's very structured, very direct. We use psychoeducation to introduce concepts and to build skills. It's a less threatening way to do this to support the client's ability or the parent's ability and to begin their own processing. So that's the structure is a very direct intervention. So indirect interventions would be creating an inclusive and safe therapy environment. So making sure, like I think we all do that, but sometimes we're limited if we work for agencies or places that have a certain physical structure that we can't do anything about, or if we're kind of visiting in a community and doing therapy within that community, but we don't have our own office there. So we want an environment that indirectly communicates safety. Um, I have a story about what not to do, and that would be to work in a building on the floor under probation or some type of correctional services. I'm in a small rural community, and we don't have a lot of options for offices and businesses and things like that. So the places that you can rent are fairly limited that would be suitable for therapy. We had a wonderful, beautiful office. It was, I think, 2,500 square feet, but it was under probation. And there was a time where they had to take somebody down and the RCMP had to come, and it happened right above my office. So luckily there was nobody in my office at the time, but those kinds of things, that doesn't communicate safety. So after that, the ceilings were insulated and we did things where we could move to different places in the building where that was much less likely to happen. So all of those environmental things are really, really important. So it's about noise. If there's a kind of a deep humming or anything like that that can trigger the neuroception of threat, we need to be aware of that. Another indirect communication of safety and indirect intervention is our intake process. So I work with some people who would love a very structured clipboard. I'm taking notes. I'm really getting into the information. And then I've got another part of the population I work with where that would be pretty offensive because they would rather come heart to heart. And those are our Indigenous clients. So we have to have different ways to support the needs of different clients right at our intake process. And it also needs to be easy access. If there's lots of barriers that are happening for people to engage in services, it makes it really hard for them to feel like their safety and that the therapy is going to go through and that it's going to be effective. So those initial things can really communicate significantly, and those are indirect interventions. So one of the indirect interventions that I do is even if somebody calls and wants services, but say we don't provide that service or we're full and aren't taking people, I will start to refer them out and I will give them as much information as they need. I'll help them kind of navigate the system because it can be overwhelming and complex. That's an indirect intervention that is supporting them, and it really communicates that I am there for them, even if they're not my clients. Now, it's not a client-therapist relationship, but it certainly indirectly communicates that we're committed to the proper and effective care of our clients. Another indirect intervention is art and music therapy. So we include some of this in phase 1, 2, and 3 of the Intergenerational Trauma Program, especially for teens. We look at music that falls in line with the window of tolerance and the polyvagal ladder. Animal-assisted therapy is one of the most powerful interventions. Sometimes we have children that start, they're very nervous, they don't want to be in therapy, but you have this silly, goofy Bernedoodle that makes everything okay. So that is one of those indirect interventions that really helps kind of ease the child into therapy and help them feel comfortable and like you can have, we're dealing with serious things, but you can still have fun here. And there's also having supportive material or watching different videos. So one of the shows that I really like, if you have really complicated impacts, especially for teens who are really shut down and won't talk and they're really hard to engage. I love watching like an episode of Meerkat Manor because the meerkats are highly alarmed, they're very reactive. There's a social element to the show as well between the meerkats that sometimes just watching that and then commenting about how that is it aligns with the family system helps them see it, but it's not a direct intervention of let's talk about your family system. It's watching it in a video or a short part of a show. Now we're going to look at strategies to engage difficult cases in complex families. So the intergenerational trauma program it's structured in phases so that it gently addresses the difficulties with difficult cases. So phase one, we join with the parent through we provide autonomic regulation for them and we teach them about this. And we also offer that co-regulation so that they're more able to engage in self-regulation. Then they offer that co-regulation to their child. We also build attachment-based parenting skills, and we gently, very gently increase their self-awareness in the parent-child relationship while the focus remains on supporting the child and supporting changes in the child. So it's a really gentle way of engaging the parent, helping support the family system and the child. That's usually the one that's been referred, so that we can gently support the parent in having more self-awareness about the trauma impacts on themselves in areas that we need to work on. Then phase two, we go into actually addressing the unresolved impacts of intergenerational trauma on the parent. And that is so that we can clear those impacts out and they have a different foundation for relationship with their own family members. Phase three is where we address the child or the teen's trauma and their trauma experience. And then we build connection and family resilience. So we also have to address the child's trauma experience to decrease their reactivity, their dysregulation, or their disconnection in the relationship with the parent. So it's really important that structure is there to be a gradual involvement in more and more deeper therapeutic work. And it's also designed so that it doesn't trigger a lot of defensiveness. We're still going to have some difficult cases though. So the structure, that structure in the process of the intergenerational trauma program provides empowerment for the parent. They're learning to self-regulate through our co-regulation. They're learning attachment-based parenting strategies. Well, we're starting to address the trauma impacts, and later we address the trauma impacts in the whole family system and intergenerationally. So one way that we can really support our clients is to incorporate their interests and their culture in therapy. So this usually we can do this, but we have to be really cautious when we're working with cultural or historical trauma because there could be some hot spots and it could be very difficult. They could feel very disconnected from their culture. And if you're trying to find out how connected they are, it may inadvertently cause some shame for them. So it's an area that is really important, especially in those cases with cultural or historical trauma. But we have to also be gentle in that as well. So adding personalization by their interests, their culture, their community it's a really positive strategy to honor the individual and who they are and what they're about. So many of our clients may have never feel honored for their interests. People may think their interests are, they don't get them or they don't understand them. But when we can pull them in, those interests into therapy, it's really important for the client and it feels highly specialized for them individually. So we want to look at their activities, interests, music, beliefs, their values, all those kinds of things to help kind of root them in the therapy process and help them feel honored as an individual. This is really important with intergenerational trauma because there's a high degree of invalidation in families impacted by intergenerational trauma. So they're not used to having their interests and activities or their culture honored and brought into the process with another person. But these are really important parts of neural integration and integration in their life and their healing. So, incorporating their culture is also a crucial step. We have to communicate safety when they do this, and we have to be open to their experiences and beliefs. So, many clients who are impacted by intergenerational trauma may also be impacted by cultural or historical trauma that will significantly impact their healing. So the healing may include honoring their culture and integrating these beliefs and strengths into the therapy process. Again, we have to do this at the level that is their individual approach to it. So if they have experienced some cultural trauma and the family has kind of separated from the culture and no longer identify with their culture, we have to balance that out with not having that be an area that's kind of cut off or dissociated from, because culture is an important part of our world and our life. That if we don't incorporate that, then there's some integration that hasn't happened due to, with related to the trauma. The difficulty is they may have very strong beliefs and values against their history or their culture. So that has to be done with respect to where that person is at. And we can't force them to change. I think we know that. We can't force them to integrate that. And we have to respect where they're at, but acknowledging that even the culture may have carried people through many generations before them, even if they believe differently. That is even a very good intervention or very good way to help them integrate their history or their culture. So strategies that we can use to help them, you can include it in your intake so it's right out front and it communicates that you're open to discussing these and in the culture and their history and their interests are important to them. We can keep their interests in mind as therapy progresses. So if they're really hands-on and they like to do things like sand tray or play therapy with kids, of course, but if they're more hands-on, we want to do interventions that are more hands-on than doing workbooks and pencil paper type things, because that's going to incorporate their interests and their strengths. It'll be important to learn about your client's culture. So, learning the history, learning their beliefs, their values, so that you have a foundation to work with. Now, again, we need cultural humility because we do not want to present ourselves like we're teaching somebody about their culture, especially if they've been kind of separated from that culture. So, it's a very delicate balance. We want to be open and we want to learn about it, but we are not the expert in other people's culture or experience. Another thing we can do is celebrating small achievements. And so this is the role of setting small achievable goals. And the reason we need to do this is that families who've been impacted by intergenerational trauma likely had years of defeat and not being good enough and not feeling like they're important or being kind of kept out of the relationships with other people. They may have experienced considerable oppression related to their emotions. Their family may not want any anger or not want any crying in the family. So those emotions are oppressed. may have relational oppression where there's a family member that's highly controlling and dictates kind of how the family's going to run. Also, maybe the opposite, where there's no structure or no boundaries in the family. And there may be cultural oppression, racism, discrimination. So we really have to be aware that they have likely had years of this kind of defeat and oppression. So they need small, achievable wins to feel like therapy is progressing and to build hope and motivation in therapy. So, for some parents, learning to identify their own autonomic state and not becoming highly dysregulated to something that kind of triggers them or reminds them of a trauma, that's a huge accomplishment for some people. And because they have been so reactive or so shut down for many years, that when they have that space between a trigger and their response, they can catch what they're feeling, regulate, and approach it differently. That may not seem like a big thing to people who aren't in that position, but that's huge for them. That's a monumental achievement. So we really need to celebrate those times where they've experienced those small achievable wins, no matter how small they are. So when the other part of that is when they apply the autonomic state and recognizing what state of their child is in to understand their behavior, that's huge for a lot of people, and it really needs to be celebrated as well. So these may seem like very small goals that would be relatively easy to achieve, but if you have come from generations of dysregulation and no awareness of autonomic state, and you start to identify those and start to identify them in your child, that's huge. So we really need to honor and celebrate the progress in there, and those small achievable wins we really need to grasp onto for the hope and the momentum in therapy. And there's kind of a relationship between the greater the impacts of intergenerational trauma, the more smaller and more the smaller the goals may be. So you may have to be very minute if there's huge impacts of intergenerational trauma, because there's skills that they haven't had the opportunity to develop. So developing those is really important to them. So the greater the impact, your goals may have to be even smaller, but not always. And sometimes they need to be small for people who have less impacts as well. So it's just gauging that for the individual and what their situation is and how their motivation level as well. So when there's greater impacts of intergenerational trauma therapy, so you see more of those things that are in the 5 domains checklist, they're working through a lot more layers than other people that don't have those impacts are working through. And that makes that smallest goal, just recognizing that you're dysregulated in an interaction, that's a monumental task. So that's where we need to really recognize and honor those and help build that momentum and hope. So, how do we celebrate these little milestones or meeting these goals? In individual therapy, you could have like a roadmap of skills that break the healing process into smaller achievable steps that they could either check off, or they have it as a reference list. It's like the list of the DBT skills. So when they start to use those skills, there's a list of the skills, and they usually write that into their diary card of what skills they've used. So that could be a similar thing done for intergenerational trauma therapy, where there's just these little skills that they use that build into a greater progress and greater healing, that it could be like a roadmap of skills for them to work towards working on. So you could do self-monitoring like the DBT diary cards. It could be used if you're doing a group, but we need to watch about like comparison between people, because if somebody has something that's a lot more complex that they've met that goal, and another person is just identifying their state, that may feel like there's a comparison there. So we have to kind of watch that in a group setting, because we don't want to promote competition, and we don't want anybody to feel a sense of shame if they're not achieving at the same level or not meeting their goals at the same level. So mini celebrations of the main concepts or the main skills. You could do certificates of achievement for completing phases of therapy. When I worked in substance abuse programs, and we would give out certificates of achievement for completing a drug education program or completing so many sessions of a drug type therapy program. Some people were like so excited about that because they had never had any kind of certificate of achievement. So those meant so much to them. Other people may have had many certificates of achievement through their work or through life and education, that it may mean less to them, but that's a really easy, small way to recognize their and celebrate their progress. If you have clients journaling, you could add special entry on what their gains are or their goals for the week, or what they've accomplished for the week, so that they continually focus on the positives that they're making. And if you could also have like a positive feedback jar or an envelope for a client, where the jar would be more for groups and the envelope would be more for the individual, where if they have, like, say they've recognized their autonomic state, you could write it on a little card, keep it in that envelope, and then every week you could have them pull a different card of what kind of goals you've observed them reaching. So the main focus on small achievable goals and celebrating these is to build that hope and momentum in clients, so that they see their progress, so that they continue to build on it, and they believe that change and healing is possible. And again, we have to remember that these are clients who sometimes have had years and years of oppression and difficulties, and not being able to climb out of the difficulties that they're having. So those small attainable goals and achievements and celebrations are really critical to building that momentum and that hope. So, in the context of difficult cases, we have to look at ways for the therapist to remain present and to have perseverance of their own, because sometimes these cases can be really difficult, obviously, and they can really be hard on the therapist because it may feel like it moves so slow, or it may feels like it's too complex or too complicated to make progress. So one thing that we want to keep an eye on is the 5 stages of therapists in intergenerational trauma therapy, and they follow along with the polyvagal ladder. So you'll have in social engagement or in ventral vagal, you'll have courageous and connected. So that's a therapist who is really like learning new interventions, applying them. They don't have a lot of anxiety. They feel confident in what they're doing. Connected would be they feel connected, but they may not feel that much courage yet, or they may feel like they still have training wheels on, but they're able to really connect at a good level with their clients and don't feel a lot of anxiety or a lot of overwhelm related to the cases they're working with. When we drop out of that and we go into sympathetic responses, we'll find fearful and frustrated. So there'll be the fearful will be a lot of worry about, oh my, I don't know these interventions. I need to work harder. I'm not making progress. What's going to happen? I'm not going to get any more referrals, all that kind of anxiety. Or it'll go into kind of fight mode, or that fight energy, and the therapist will get frustrated. They will be disappointed in clients and kind of having difficulties with the difficulties that clients are having. So they can start to build frustration. And that's when you know, when you have that anxiety, and feel fearful or frustrated, we need to do some supervision or peer consultation to really address those, because it will throw therapy off and it also leads to burnout. So if we don't address those and we live with a high degree of anxiety about not being an effective therapist or not making progress or not going to be getting referrals, and we get frustrated, the next stage is that dorsal vagal, where we can collapse as a therapist and just kind of freeze, go through the motions, not have any kind of excitement or engagement in the therapy process. And these are where these last three stages are where people decide that they no longer want to be a therapist, even though they've dedicated years and years to their education and they've spent tons of money and time that they've invested in developing these skills. So those are your danger zones for therapists. So it's courageous and connected, or that ventral vagal, so they're safe and connected. Fearful, frustrated, and collapsed are more your sympathetic and dorsal vagal responses in therapy. So strategies for us to maintain our professional presence and resilience. This is a very brief list. There's books written on this. There's whole programs written on this or developed on this that are important for us to be aware of. But some of the simple things are having a mindfulness practice or having some kind of ritual or mindful activity that you do between sessions. Making sure you're doing self-care and having downtime, making sure that maybe you don't start the morning in a rush and you have time at the beginning to just kind of relax and ease into the day. Um, and time away from professional development and focusing on career. So just downtime where you're not working and you're just kind of enjoying life and having fun. Supervision and consultation are so important for us to make sure that we have, because that's where we get ideas from other people, where we see things differently and we get that support. And we're not isolated with the work that we do when we have that supervision and consultation. We also want to continue to build skills. We don't want to get stagnant in our own professional development, but we also don't want to overtrain because it'll get hard to apply what you've learned if you're training in all these different interventions. So mastering one is a great way to build that skill and then move on to another type of skill. So we always want to be building those skills and keeping skills fresh so that we feel like there's momentum and we're meeting those small achievable goals in our own professional development as well. So this is the reason that the Intergenerational Trauma Therapists group on Facebook, that's why we want it to be a compassionate community. We want people to feel supported. We want people to engage in a way that helps them have that collegial support. We can't do supervision or consultation in there, but maybe out of that, we can have those activities that support people. So just a recap of what we've covered. We looked at resistance in therapy and why I don't like that word and how to reframe it to resilience that's no longer useful and interferes in the present. We've looked at strategies to engage clients and families, including direct and indirect interventions, including clients' interest and culture, celebrating small achievements, and maintaining our own professional presence and perseverance. So I would encourage you to seek specialized training, of course, and support. That consultation and supervision is so important with these cases, because they can be really difficult because you're dealing with 4 or 5 generations of impacts of trauma. So that's why it's so important to have that support. If you want, again, that 5 domains checklist, go to 5domainschecklist.com and you can get a copy and a mini training of the ways to identify the impacts of intergenerational trauma when you're working with a family. So I will see you next time, and we're going to shift into complex trauma. So I hope you have a beautiful day.